Everyone thought Russia's most protected air assets were untouchable, too deep, too expensive, too heavily defended to ever be seriously threatened. Then one night, without warning, something went wrong in a way no one had planned for. No alarms could explain, and no doctrine could immediately answer. No massive explosion, no burning runway. Just silence, confusion, and a strategic bomber that suddenly could not fly. At first, officials downplayed it. Analysts hesitated. And then the footage emerged, revealing a chain of decisions and failures so precise, so unexpected, that it forced an uncomfortable question. How could something designed to be invulnerable be neutralized without being destroyed? What made this operation truly consequential was not the physical damage inflicted, but the way it redefined what success looks like in modern warfare. Instead of chasing the traditional objective of spectacular destruction, the strike was engineered to seize control over the enemy's future decisions. By crippling the bomber rather than annihilating it, Ukraine transformed a single airframe into a long-term strategic dilemma. A destroyed aircraft is simple. It is counted, written off, and replaced if possible. A technically intact but non-functional bomber is far more dangerous to its owner. It demands endless verification, internal investigations, engineering audits, and command-level risk assessments. Every unanswered question about hidden damage, compromised systems, or latent failures injects doubt into planning cycles. Can it be repaired safely? Can similar aircraft be trusted? Are maintenance procedures still valid under combat conditions? Each question slows decisions, postpones operations, and fractures confidence inside the command structure. The absence of a dramatic fireball is precisely the point. Spectacle fades quickly. Uncertainty compounds over time. A silent airframe sitting on the apron becomes a persistent reminder that defenses failed in a way they cannot easily explain or correct. This forces commanders to assume worst-case scenarios, expanding safety margins, increasing dispersal, and delaying missions that once felt routine. In strategic terms, this is coercive warfare at its most refined, not compelling behavior through overt destruction, but constraining behavior by making every option feel unsafe. The enemy is not reacting to what was lost, but to what might go wrong next. By leaving the bomber structurally intact, yet strategically dead, the strike imposed a psychological tax that far exceeds the material cost of repair. Planning is no longer about capability alone, but about risk tolerance under uncertainty. That shift is
satellite
profound.
imagery is inconclusive.
When an adversary can no longer confidently predict which assets are truly secure, deterrence erodes from the inside. The battlefield moves from runways and hangars into briefing rooms and decision loops, where hesitation becomes the most valuable effect of all. What ultimately opened the door for this strike was not a breakthrough in weapons technology or an overwhelming surge of firepower, but something far more mundane and far more dangerous: logistics friction. The delayed delivery of NK-32 engine components quietly transformed a strategic bomber from a symbol of reach and deterrence into a stationary liability, designed to spend most of its life either flying, cycling through tightly controlled maintenance windows, or sitting briefly in protected shelters. The aircraft was never meant to remain exposed and inactive for days on end. High-value platforms like this are optimized for performance under stress, not for prolonged stillness under observation. When movement stops, predictability begins, and predictability is lethal. This is where the deeper vulnerability emerged. The bomber did not fail because it lacked protection. It failed because the system supporting it lost elasticity. Modern military power depends not just on the ability to operate, but on the ability to recover, adapt, and absorb disruption. Sanctions did not ground aircraft by force. They eroded the spare parts pipeline, slowed certification cycles, and stretched maintenance timelines until small delays became operational liabilities. Each postponed component delivery extended exposure, turning time itself into an adversary. The aircraft was not waiting to be attacked, it was waiting to become vulnerable. There is an uncomfortable lesson here for any force that relies on complex, high-end platforms. When logistics falter, even briefly, the cost of protection skyrockets. Guards must rotate longer, defenses must remain alert for extended periods, and commanders are forced to accept risk they never planned for. Some will see this as an extraordinary coincidence exploited by an opportunistic adversary. Others may argue it was the inevitable outcome of a system strained beyond its margins, where resilience mattered more than raw capability. The question that lingers is not whether this vulnerability could have been avoided, but whether similar friction exists elsewhere, quietly accumulating risk. I'm curious where you stand on this. Was this a rare alignment of circumstances, or a warning sign of a deeper structural problem? Share your thoughts in the comments.
58.
What makes the failure of air defense in this operation so revealing is that it did not stem from negligence, poor training, or malfunctioning equipment. The system behaved exactly as it was designed to behave, and that precision became its weakness. Russian air defense doctrine is built around defeating fast, high-altitude, long-range threats, cruise missiles, bombers, and aircraft approaching from predictable vectors. The S-400 excels in that environment, where speed and distance define danger and where early detection translates into decisive interception. Against that model of war, the system is formidable. The problem is that the battlefield no longer conforms to that model. Low-altitude threats were not overlooked by accident. They were consciously deprioritized. Doctrine assumed that anything flying slowly, close to the ground, and without strong emissions posed a secondary risk compared to high-speed strategic weapons. Sensors, engagement logic, and operator training all reflected this hierarchy of danger. In theory, this made sense. In practice, it created a blind zone not in coverage, but in attention. When an adversary deliberately refuses to match the profile you prepared for, even the most sophisticated defenses can become rigid rather than resilient.
I understand that, but the convoy cannot reroute through Rostov.
Correct
We don't have
behavior
clearance.
is what made it exploitable. Once Ukraine understood how the system would prioritize targets, the sequence of events became less about brute force and more about choreography. High-altitude decoys triggered the exact response the doctrine demanded, pulling radar focus, tracking capacity, and interceptor resources upward. Meanwhile, the real threat remained below, operating in the space the system considered manageable, delayed, or less urgent. This was not a technological defeat, it was a conceptual one. The deeper implication is unsettling. Air defense systems are often evaluated by their technical specifications range, radar power, missile speed. But wars are not fought against specifications, they are fought against expectations. When doctrine becomes too confident in defining what a threat should look like, it teaches the enemy exactly how not to look like one. In that sense, the failure was not that the air defense was wrong, but that it was too right for a war that no longer exists. Long before the first explosion, before air defenses reacted or alarms were even considered, the outcome of the operation had already been set in motion. The decisive moment was not the strike itself, but the reconnaissance phase that quietly erased uncertainty. These ISR drones were not searching for targets in the traditional sense. The locations were already known. What they were doing was far more consequential, validating assumptions. In modern warfare, assumptions are often the weakest link. Plans are built on them, defenses rely on them, and commanders trust them until proven otherwise. The moment those assumptions are confirmed or disproven, the battle shifts from possibility to inevitability. Thermal imagery played a critical role in that shift. Visual confirmation that the bomber remained exposed and that missile bunkers were fully loaded did more than identify targets. It locked in strategic certainty. There is a profound difference between believing an asset might be vulnerable and knowing that it is. Once the heat signatures told the full story, hesitation disappeared from the planning process. At that point, the question was no longer whether the strike should happen, but how precisely it should unfold. Risk calculations narrowed, contingencies tightened, and the operation moved from conceptual planning into execution. Equally important was the mapping of human behavior. Guard rotations, patrol paths, and response timings were measured down to the second. This transformed a heavily defended base into a predictable system governed by routines rather than reactions. When patterns become visible, complexity collapses. What appears formidable from the outside becomes procedural from within. Each patrol cycle confirmed that no unexpected variables were being introduced, no heightened alert states triggered, no adaptive behavior emerging. Silence from radios and sensors was not reassurance for the defenders, it was confirmation for the attackers. By the time the drones withdrew, the engagement was effectively over in strategic terms. The strike force had not yet launched, but the fight had already been decided. From that moment on, execution was simply the mechanical application of information already gathered. In modern conflict, reconnaissance is no longer a prelude to battle. It is the moment when battle ends and outcomes become unavoidable. One of the most revealing dimensions of the strike was how cost-asymmetry itself became a weapon, embedded directly into the mechanics of the kill chain. This was not simply a case of cheap systems defeating expensive ones, but a deliberate manipulation of how value, priority, and urgency are interpreted inside air defense networks. When interceptors costing more than $12 million were launched against decoys worth a fraction of that price, the imbalance was obvious, but the financial loss was never the true objective. The real target was attention. By forcing high-end systems to engage low-cost stimuli, the operation redirected focus, processing power, and human judgment toward the least consequential elements of the threat. This is where the concept of economic overkill turns into cognitive overload. Air defense systems are designed to treat certain signatures as inherently dangerous, regardless of cost. Once classified as high priority, those targets demand immediate action, saturating tracking channels and decision loops. Operators do not weigh price tags in the moment. They respond to threat profiles embedded in doctrine and software. By exploiting that logic, the strike converted financial asymmetry into mental friction. Every interceptor launched upward was not just money spent, but attention consumed, bandwidth occupied, and alternatives delayed. What makes this tactic especially effective is that it operates below the threshold of obvious failure. From the defender's perspective, the system was doing its job. Missiles launched, targets destroyed, procedures followed. Yet with each successful intercept, the system became more distracted from what mattered most. The defenders were not losing control of the airspace, they were losing control of prioritization. In modern combat, that distinction is critical. Victory increasingly depends on shaping what the enemy looks at, not simply what they can shoot. There is no single correct interpretation here. Some professionals might view this as an unsustainable tactic that relies too heavily on favorable cost ratios, while others may see it as an inevitable evolution of warfare in an age where attention is as finite as ammunition. What is clear is that the engagement challenges long-held assumptions about efficiency, value, and dominance. Whether this represents a clever exploitation of a temporary imbalance or a lasting shift in how wars are fought is a question that different experts will likely answer in very different ways. What made the use of decoys in this operation especially powerful was that they did far more than distract or delay defensive reactions. They actively rewrote the radar picture the system believed to be true. These were not generic false targets designed to create noise. Their electronic signatures were carefully shaped to resemble cruise missiles, the very class of threat Russian air defenses are optimized to detect and defeat. Speed, altitude changes, radar cross-section, and signal behavior all aligned with what the system had been trained to treat as strategically dangerous. As a result, the decoys were not merely noticed, they were believed. Once those contacts were classified as high-priority threats, the system entered a state from which it could not easily back out. Air defense automation is designed to escalate quickly, not to second-guess itself. De-escalation requires additional confirmation, time, and often human intervention, all of which are scarce during a perceived inbound strike. In this case, the classification itself became a trap. The moment the system committed to the cruise missile narrative, every subsequent sensor input was interpreted through that lens. Data that did not fit was filtered, delayed, or deprioritized. What mattered was not what was actually happening in the airspace, but what the system had already decided was happening. This is where automation quietly overpowered human judgment. Operators were no longer free to interpret the situation holistically. They were managing a story already written by algorithms. Radar displays, threat alerts, and engagement cues reinforced one another, creating a feedback loop that made alternative interpretations increasingly unlikely. Even if doubts emerged at the operator level, the momentum of the system favored action over reconsideration. The faster and more automated the response, the harder it became to interrupt. In effect, the decoys turned the air defense network into a narrator, telling itself a convincing but false story. While attention and resources were consumed by that narrative, the real threat moved through the gaps it created. This was not a failure of sensors or personnel, but a demonstration of how belief, once embedded in automated systems, can become a vulnerability. When defenses are built to trust their own classifications, absolutely, deception no longer needs to hide reality, it only needs to replace it. The failure of the close-in defense was not the result of overwhelming firepower or the physical destruction of the system itself, but of time being turned into a weapon. The Pantsir batteries remained operational throughout the engagement. Their radars tracked targets, their guns fired, and their crews followed established procedures. Yet the system still failed, not because it could not see enough, but because it could not decide fast enough. In a saturation environment, the critical bottleneck was no longer detection or range, but the speed at which fire control confirmations could be generated, validated, and executed. Delays measured in
at
fractions
this
of a
map
second
and reflect
became
on the
decisive
sacrifices
when
made.
targets were closing at low
stand at a
altitude
crossroads.
and high
We
relative
initiate
speed.
phase 1.
Those micro-delays compounded under
about option
stress.
2?
As the
No time,
engagement
execute.
continued, heat buildup in the cannons and strain on ammunition feeds subtly degraded performance.
Cost-33,
None
всё
of this
тихо.
registered as
Ожидаем
catastrophic
дальнейших
damage.
указаний.
There were no disabled radars or destroyed launchers. Instead, responsiveness eroded quietly. Tracking solutions took just a little longer to stabilize. Lock confirmations hesitated for just a moment more than they
Цель
should have.
захвачена,
In
подавление
isolation,
активно.
each delay was negligible.
Отличная работа,
Together,
продолжаем.
they created gaps large enough for fast-moving drones to slip through. For roughly 40 seconds, the system existed in a paradoxical state. It was fully powered, fully armed, and actively firing, yet functionally blind. Not blind in the sense of missing targets, but blind in its ability to prioritize and respond with sufficient tempo. The system was always reacting to
У
what
нас
had just
несанкционированный
happened, not
контакт.
what was
Код
happening
красный.
next.
Повторяю,
By the
код
time a
красный.
firing
Курс
solution
перехвата
matured, the target had already changed altitude, heading, or position. The defense was alive, but trapped in the past. This moment exposes a fundamental vulnerability in point
Realization
defense
that
systems
strength
built
alone
around
was
human-machine
not enough.
cooperation. When engagement timelines compress beyond human cognitive speed, the system does not collapse dramatically. It simply lags. And in modern combat, lag is often indistinguishable from failure. The Pantsir was not
Bunkers
defeated
1
by
through
superior
5.
weapons, but by an
Follow the green
adversary that
schematic
understood how to
precisely.
stretch time just enough to turn milliseconds into openings, and openings into decisive effects. What ultimately reveals the strategic intelligence behind the operation is that the bomber itself was never the primary objective. It was a means, not an end. The real target was strike capacity, and that capacity did not reside in the airframe sitting on the apron, but in the fully fueled KH-101 cruise missiles stored nearby. Aircraft can be repaired, rotated, or replaced over time. Missiles that are destroyed before launch erase missions that never get the chance to exist. By striking the bunkers, the operation reached forward in time and removed options from Russia's future decision space. Destroying those missiles did more than reduce inventory. It collapsed planning. Each KH-101 represents not just a weapon, but a sequence. Targeting, routing, launch coordination, and follow-on effects. When dozens of those missiles vanished in minutes, entire strike packages dissolved instantly. There was no opportunity to adapt or substitute. The sorties tied to those weapons were not delayed. They were canceled outright. This is what makes the effect temporal rather than purely physical. The damage was measured not only in dollars or tonnage, but in lost calendar days and broken operational
The
rhythms.
reserves are depleted, General.
Eliminating
We
missiles
cannot
changes
hold
the
Sector
character
4
of
without
command
resupply.
decisions. Leaders are no longer choosing between targets, timing, or escalation levels. They are choosing between doing nothing and
impossible.
accepting risk
Call it off.
elsewhere. Winter
Understood,
strike
General.
plans,
Erasing
built
the
months in
markers now.
advance around stockpile assumptions, suddenly became fiction. Rewriting them under pressure meant fewer launches,
Still
longer
nothing.
intervals, and
How long
reduced
do we wait?
concentration of effects. That loss of tempo is
The command
strategic because it cannot be quickly reversed by moving assets or increasing alert levels. In this context,
front
the
lines,
bomber's
Major.
survival almost
These nodes are the
reinforces the
target.
point. It stands
take
as a
this
visible
hub.
platform
Strike was
with
successful.
nothing meaningful
Minimal
left to deliver.
resistance reported.
The presence of the aircraft creates the illusion of
Main-
capability, while the absence of missiles reveals the truth beneath it. This is a form of warfare that targets the future rather than the present, where success is defined by what never
Telemetry
happens.
confirms
By
successful
removing
deployment.
strike options before
Good.
they could be exercised,
Start the
the
cooldown
operation
sequence.
achieved a victory measured in time denied, not territory taken. One of the most understated but transformative elements of the operation was how learning itself became a weapon. Every drone lost was not simply a casualty, it was a sensor event. In the final milliseconds before destruction, telemetry captured trajectory shifts, tracer density, turret
Товарищ
rotation
полковник,
speed, wind
у нас нет
effects, and
снарядов.
engagement time.
График
That
остановлен.
data did not disappear with the
Кри
drone.
на эту пушку,
It was
и
absorbed,
больше нет.
processed,
Вас понял,
and
товарищ майор.
redistributed
Раз,
across the
два,
remaining swarm
три.
in near real
Cannot
time,
leave this
turning
sector
loss into
unprotected, Colonel.
immediate
The
tactical
risk is
advantage.
unacceptable.
What
don't
looked
have
like
the
attrition
reserves.
from the outside was, in practice, a continuous feedback loop that sharpened the behavior of what remained. This dynamic exposes a widening gap between machine-coordinated systems and human-operated defenses. Human crews, no matter how trained, must observe, interpret, decide, and act in sequence. Machine-shared learning collapses those steps. Adjustments happen automatically, without debate or delay. When a firing arc proves lethal, flight paths shift by meters. When a reload cycle is detected, timing compresses around it. The swarm does not need to understand why a pattern works. It only needs to recognize that it does. Iteration happens faster than explanation, and adaptation outpaces command. As the engagement progressed, this imbalance became decisive. The defense was responding to data that was already outdated by the time it reached operators. Each firing solution was based on the last behavior observed, not the next one coming. In contrast, the swarm was continuously updating its model of the battlefield, refining movement with every interaction. The result was asymmetrical time perception. The defenders were fighting the past, while the attackers were flying the present. This represents a shift that goes beyond drones or air defense. It signals a future where the side that learns faster during contact gains an advantage independent of platform quality or numbers. Systems that cannot adapt at machine speed risk becoming predictable, even when they are powerful. If you value objective analysis over speculation and noise, consider following this channel. We focus on how decisions are made and how those decisions reshape the battlefield long after the moment of contact. The most enduring consequences of the operation emerged only after the firing stopped, when no drones remained in the air and no defenses were actively engaged. The physical damage was finite and measurable, but the psychological impact expanded quietly through planning staffs and command structures. The relocation of strategic bombers thousands of kilometers east was not a tactical necessity forced by destroyed infrastructure. It was a strategic choice driven by doubt. That movement alone signaled a silent admission that areas once considered safe could no longer be trusted. When assets of that value are pulled back, it is not because they are unusable, but because confidence in their protection has eroded. This shift carried cascading effects. Missions now required longer flight times, greater fuel consumption, and increased maintenance strain. Sortie efficiency dropped, not because crews were less capable, but because every mission had to account for expanded risk envelopes. Planning horizons shortened as well. Instead of long-term strike schedules built around predictable basing and stockpiles, planners were forced into shorter cycles, constantly reassessing exposure and vulnerability. Strategic rhythm gave way to tactical caution, and with it, the ability to sustain pressure over time weakened. Perhaps the most significant outcome was the collapse of the idea of untouchable depth. No runways were cratered, no bases permanently destroyed. Yet the psychological boundary that once separated frontline danger from rear area security dissolved. Depth had functioned as a form of armor, allowing planners to assume that distance alone provided safety. Once that assumption failed, every kilometer of airspace became contested in the mind, even if not yet in reality. The battlefield expanded inward. What makes this kind of effect so powerful is its persistence. Physical damage can be repaired, systems can be replaced, and inventories rebuilt. Confidence is harder to restore. When commanders begin to question what is truly secure, every decision carries additional friction. In that sense, the operation achieves something more enduring than destruction. It altered how risk is perceived, how plans are structured, and how future actions are constrained. The deepest damage was not what burned or broke, but what quietly stopped being believed. When you step back from the battlefield details, the lesson here is surprisingly familiar to everyday life. The outcome was not decided by brute strength, but by awareness, timing, and the ability to adapt when old assumptions stopped working. For many of us, especially as we grow older, progress rarely comes from dramatic moves or loud victories. It comes from understanding where we are exposed, recognizing when routines have become rigid, and knowing when a small adjustment can prevent a much larger loss later. This story is also a reminder that resilience matters more than appearance. Expensive tools, impressive titles, or long-standing reputations do not guarantee security if the systems supporting them quietly weaken. In careers, finances, health, or relationships, it is often the overlooked details, the delays, the habits we stop questioning, the warnings we assume will never matter, that create the greatest risk. Perhaps the most important takeaway is this: real control is not about reacting faster when trouble arrives, but about seeing clearly before it does. The people who fare best over time are rarely those who move the hardest or spend the most, but those who stay flexible, pay attention, and are willing to rethink what they once believed was untouchable. In a changing world, that mindset may be the most valuable asset of all.